I'm doing green screen stuff now because I think it's fun, but yeah. Like to hear your comments anyway. Okay, so Space Wars. I've talked about space stuff recently, but it was like 80% nerdy stuff and then 20% like cool bang bang stuff. And my goal with this video is to make the pie chart go from this to this. Lots of militaries now have things that will kill you in space, and there are even war crimes that you can only commit once you leave the atmosphere, which is kind of fun to think about. We'll be taking a look at those, how space warfare works, what weapons and gear you'd use to fight in it, and figure out if astronaut food is worse than just normal MREs. With China's new Death Star microwave beams, the United States' latest space bomber prototype, and more killer lasers than an EDM concert, there is a lot of stuff to talk about here. But before we do that, I need to mention today's sponsor, Conflict of Nations. Conflict of Nations is a free-to-play online PvP strategy game where you lead a real country during a future World War III scenario. You'll be battling it out with up to 128 other real-world players in real-time persistent games that can last for weeks. Build your army of tanks, jets, and submarines, form alliances, and declare war on your neighbors while engaging in an epic campaign to take over the entire world. The extensive tech tree, wide variety of units to build, and detailed planning it takes in order to win your battles will ensure that as soon as you win your first game, you'll be frothing for more. Conflict of Nations lets you play with the same account on both PC and mobile devices, and if you use my link down in the description, you'll receive 13,000 gold and a 1-month premium subscription for absolute free. This offer only lasts for the next 30 days, so make sure you do not miss out on this and gain the upper hand in your quest for world dominations. Thank you, Conflict of Nations. Back to the video. Newsflash: space is hard. Not like physically hard because there's nothing to touch up there, but because unlike on the ground where our forefathers settled their differences, you can't just pull up on the ops with a Glock 40 problem solver and handle things like a man. You need ships and spacesuits and little jetpack things to fly around in. China recently claimed a breakthrough in a high-powered microwave weapon, what some are calling the Chinese Death Star. Calling any laser in space a Death Star laser is an easy thing to say and low-hanging fruit, but there is actually something very specific that makes it a Death Star laser and not just like a proton torpedo thing. The breakthrough lies in the fact that it can focus multiple beams into one, which has the effect of multiplying the power of each shot as a whole. The PRC put a lot of effort into developing these microwave weapons because they're very good at just frying electrical components, the kind that you would have on satellites and spaceships and personal welfare devices, if you will. And they're able to destroy things without having to resort to just burning them up and melting them to death. Allegedly, during testing, they were able to have a successful beam impact at a range of 1,100 miles, and according to the scientists who worked on the project, they would be able to suppress signals from American GPS and other satellites. Admittedly, those same scientists said that as of today, the laser does not have an effective combat capability, but much like my mediocre side gig, everything has to start somewhere. Now, going up into space until very recently has always been very much dominated by the government, and therefore, by extension, the military. As the vast majority of astronauts, cosmonauts, and taikonauts even today have some kind of military background. Considering the space race in the 60s was really just a way to prove that we had better missiles and therefore could shoot nukes better than the other side, there's always been a tinge of militarism in there somewhere. Now, just like you can't help but laugh when you remember that the Navy calls their people seamen, you can't expect to win a fight in space if you don't have a space station, or at least something close to a space station. The Ruskies way back in the day had their first attempt at a military-style space station with the Almaz, which translates to diamond, and it was part of a secret Soviet military space station program that started in the early 60s. Though designated as quote-unquote civilian vessels, if you can even call a Soviet space station that, they were in fact fully crewed secret military reconnaissance stations. A total of 3 were ever launched, all disguised as nice little peaceful civilian spaceships. The first launch, Salyut 2, accidentally fell out of orbit, while the other 2, Salyut 3 and 5, ended up being fully successful. Armed with a suite of sensors and high-powered cameras, their job was to collect as much geospatial data as they could given the technology at the time. But you didn't make it this far into the video just to talk about cameras, obviously. No, we're here to talk about the 23mm autocannon that they slapped on the back of this thing. Capable of firing up to 2,600 rounds per minute, it was a modified version of the tail gun found on the Tu-22 bombers at the time, and the fastest firing single-barrel cannon ever introduced into service. Unlike its terrestrial cousins that sat happy on the back of a plane, the space version was completely fixed into the actual body of the space station. While from an engineering standpoint, this is the simplest and easiest way to strap a gun onto something, it made it to where the only way you could aim it was to rotate the entire space station directly at the target. The only firing control on this thing was a crude little reticule to aim, and maneuvering the entire space station to aim it took a lot of time, a lot of fuel, and firing it allegedly made the entire thing shake worse than a Mormon on his wedding night. Theoretically, it was designed as a point defense weapon rather than an offensive weapon, with the high rate of fire helping to increase the odds that enough rounds would destroy an incoming missile. Now, if this thing ever got picked up more, obviously it probably would have been mounted to some kind of thing that would be able to maneuver on its own, but we never got to figure out what that would actually look like, because after the Soviets fired 20 test rounds, they plummeted the entire station into the atmosphere and it burned up to a crisp, which they should not have done, because littering is wrong. This message was brought to you by turtles that get caught in those beer plastic thingies. Now, the Soviets did develop the TP-82 Cosmonaut pistol, which combined a double-barrel shotgun with a 5.45 rifle barrel into one ludicrously fun design, but that was designed for if the crew landed and needed to attempt to not die while stranded in the Siberian wilderness. I guess theoretically a drive-by spacewalk type beat would have been possible, but the opportunity never arose. America at the time was focused on the Boeing X20 Dinosaurs, less a space station and more of a space plane that would be able to drop bombs from high altitude and shoot Soviet satellites out of the sky. With a max speed of 17,500 miles per hour, the goal was to have a ship that was totally untraceable, let alone untouchable by Soviet air defenses. Unfortunately for us, it turns out that it makes way more sense just to fire a missile at a target like the then newly introduced Minuteman II, rather than create a crude aircraft that went into space to drop significantly smaller munitions with the accuracy akin to handing a blind guy a musket. But the US has been working on what you could call the successor to the X-20, the X-37B, also known as the Orbital Test Vehicle. While admittedly being significantly more phallic shaped than its predecessor, this unmanned spacecraft, which looks like you tried to draw the space shuttle from memory, is officially for quote-unquote peaceful purposes, such as satellite repair, bringing astronaut supplies, and testing space-based communications. We did it, guys. We finally figured out how to use taxpayer dollars for the good of all mankind. Just kidding, because unofficially, it's a test bed for sabotaging enemy satellites, spying on areas that our satellites can't easily get to, and using directed energy weapons to melt things that other countries fired into orbit that we do not want there anymore. A 2010 article in Space Daily laid out how the X-37 would be able to essentially be a roving satellite killer, staying in orbit until the time came to remind a few Chinese space assets what gravity is. The DoD of course denies this entirely, but they do say that the purpose of this project is to respond to combat air force and combatant command requirements, which translates to we're probs gonna strap some bang bang shooty things to this bad boy. According to investigative journalist Sharon Weinberger, the X-37 would be able to carry 2,000-pound reentry vehicles, able to house things like bunker buster bombs or hypersonic kinetic rods. And this idea is based on an express Air Force idea from the mid-90s. And at that point, it would basically serve as another layer of stealth bomber, admittedly fewer in number and not able to carry as much. It would be able to hit high priority targets from outside of a contested airspace and well outside of any air defense ranges that they would try to shoot it down with. You can imagine a scenario where these would be used against things like aircraft carriers, missile batteries, or wherever the head honcho of whomever we're fighting happens to be sitting. Now, whether or not this article is accurate or not in its assessment is questionable at best, and I would never want to assume someone's emotional feelings towards a topic or anything like that, but this is the last paragraph of the article. I'll give you a second to read that, so maybe take all this with a grain of salt. But this is nothing compared to what the Rods of God program would have been able to put out. I don't think anything describes what these things are capable of better than the SF Gate article titled "Imagine a bundle of telephone poles hurtling through space at 7,000 miles per hour," because that's basically what they are. Given the name hypervelocity rod bundles by the Air Force, it would include 6 to 8 different satellites in orbit around the planet, and be able to hit anything on Earth within 12 to 15 minutes of being activated. Less than half the time it would take for an ICBM to hit a target. The advantage of these things is that because they're firing basically perpendicular to the target, interception would be basically impossible. And because they're just solid tungsten rods, even if you were to divert them or blow them up a little bit, they're still going to have all the energy of their payload once they hit the ground, so anything around the target is still going to get the full impact of anything those things were carrying. Air Force reports state that a 20-foot rod hitting the ground at Mach 10, which is a conservative number given that they're coming out of orbit, would have the equivalent kinetic energy of 11.5 tons of TNT. That's slightly less than the bomb dropped on Hiroshima, but slightly more than a Moab, so do with that as you will. Now, ignoring the fact that a weapon like that would really only work once because it would be very easily adapted to, is wildly expensive and still not much better than conventional munitions despite being way harder to implement, there is still one big fat thing that gets in the way of all the fun stuff we've been talking about. In a totally unexpected and uncharacteristic move, the UN made sure that they got together and made sure that the dreams of every male human of dogfighting in space would never really come to fruition. The Outer Space Treaty, or if you're a nerd, the Treaty on Principles Governing the Activities of States in the Exploration and Use of Outer Space, including the Moon and other celestial bodies, not only wins the award for treaty with the most unnecessarily long name, but it sets the outline of the do's and don'ts of operating in space. And as the name implies, covers not just the Moon, but anything else deemed a celestial body, which I believe was your mother's nickname in high school. The Space Treaty, in short, was created so that in the case that the Cold War went hot, space itself wouldn't just become another big battlefield and destroy any hope of humanity of ever actually reaching the stars. Some things in this include that you can't put nukes in space, which is largely interpreted as dedicated weapons platforms in general, but non-nuclear conventional weapons are not expressly banned, so it's generally frowned upon, but not illegal. Additionally, nations cannot claim ownership of any part of space, so no space borders. Anyone is allowed to go anywhere they want in space, see rule above. And finally, if you go to the moon, it has to be for peaceful purposes. No military bases on the moon allowed. That one I'm all for, because can you imagine just being like a private in the military being told that you're being sent to the moon and then trying to figure out how to get the government to reimburse you for you having to find a way to get up to the moon? That would just be a fate worse than hell. More rules include liability coverage. If you accidentally break someone else's spaceship, you do have to pay to repair it. If you come across a dead astronaut, you have to help return him or her to Earth regardless of what country they came from. And finally, most importantly, you have to register your space vehicles with the UN. This implies that somewhere in the UN there is an office that is essentially just the DMV but for space. Government bureaucracy knows no bounds. There have been some challenges to this treaty in recent years though, with things like the Commercial Space Launch Competitiveness Act of 2015, which legalized space mining, and this one time countries around the equator tried to rally and say that they own space directly above them, but generally speaking, if you're an equatorial based country, you're largely ignored in a geopolitical sense, so that didn't go anywhere. What I do think is funny is just the sheer number of countries that actually signed this treaty. Obviously, you have China, Russia, and the United States, but you also have Zambia, Fiji, and Afghanistan. Afghanistan even signed it twice. Personally, I would like to see what a Taliban space agency looks like, but they're still trying to figure out how to fly helicopters, so there's a ways to go for that one. But because it's more practical to just slap a nuke into a stealth bomber and fly it into a country rather than fire it from a missile, the things that the treaty was made to protect against never really existed in the first place. In fact, it was quickly figured out that shooting really anything from space into Earth is essentially the most expensive and inefficient way of doing literally anything. And that's why we keep getting these cool laser things, and I'm all for it. But before I go, once again, make sure you check out the link down in my description and take advantage of all the free goodies that Conflicted Nation has to offer, as you play in a real-time PvP strategy game with all the bells and whistles of modern conflict at your fingertips. Take over the world with your armies, clan up with your friends, and see your enemies drive a car for you, or whatever it was that Conan the Barbarian said that one time. Thank you for watching, subscribe, we'll see you on that one.